All right, we're going to get started. So thank you for coming out tonight. This is continuing our study in covenant theology, following John T. Rhodes' book, Covenants Made Simple. And just like I summarized previously, it's a study of covenant theology and the biblical understanding of God's promises to his people. Let me pray, and then we'll jump in. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for bringing us out tonight. Thank you for giving us strength and health. Thank you for giving us this opportunity, Lord, to dig in deeper into your word, to try to understand how your word fits together and how the beautiful history of redemption fits together. Please be with us tonight, Lord. Help us, give us understanding. Help us to have a clear mind of thought to reason through your truths. Amen. Is it too loud, Matt? I'm getting a lot of echo. Okay. All right, so we are in chapter 7 from the book, and it is the new covenant. So I'm going to, if you got a sheet, you saw from the sheet that there's a lot of passages on there. So we're going to be jumping throughout the Bible today. We're going to be looking at a lot of different passages, trying to just make certain connections that are there. So just if you don't, I tried to put most of them on there. So if you don't follow along through all the passages, that's okay. And we're not going to go to every single one that's on your sheet there. But at least you have it there so you can study it at home and kind of look at those passages a little bit deeper. But if you can just hang in there, try to follow along. We're going to try to make some connections. And as we go through all of the passages, just keep the big points, the big themes, the big categories in mind, for I think that will help you. So as I did in the previous sections, I'll just draw out again what we're doing. So you have the story of redemption, right? So you have the beginning, you have Adam, and you have the Adamic covenant that is made there, and that represents the covenant of works. And then you have Noah, and you have the Noahic covenant. We talked about that. Then you have Abraham. Then you have the Abrahamic covenant. And all of this then, and really stemming right part of the Adamic covenant, I think, and then stemming all the way to the end, that is all the covenant of grace. So those are the two broad categories that covenant theology breaks it down. You have the covenant of works with Adam, beginning with Adam, and then being fulfilled ultimately in Christ. And then you have the covenant of grace, which is overshadowing and manifesting itself in all of the smaller covenants. Noah, Abraham, then you have David, and then you have the new covenant. And this is where we find ourselves today. So we looked at all the different covenants up to this point. We looked at the different aspects of those covenants, the aspect of the seeds and how that works out, the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent, and the battle, the tension that's there. So what I want to do in the beginning, before we jump into the new covenant, is look at how the new covenant is being looked forward to in all of the previous covenants. Because I think that's important. That's a very important theme when you come to covenant theology. Covenant theology is all about connecting the whole storyline, the redemptive storyline of Scripture. It does not view each of these covenants as individual covenants. And the reason why it does that, covenant theology argues that the reason it does that, because that's exactly how the apostles viewed the Old Testament. That is how the apostles understood the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures. So let's look at some at all of these covenants and just pick just a few points to how they look forward to the new covenant. So you have the Adamic covenant, which is the covenant of works, and then I would say kind of the beginning of the covenant of grace and how that works together. In Genesis 3:15, we looked at this passage, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. So we spent a lot of time talking about the tension that's presented there, and how that tension continues to work itself out through Genesis, and then pretty much through all of redemptive history. But what that passage is doing, that passage is looking forward to something greater. Looking forward to something that is meant to fulfill or complete or end this battle and this tension. And then in Romans 5, Paul does that. I think he ties those two together in Romans 5 when he looks at the two Adams. He looks at the first Adam and how he has failed and sin entered in. Therefore, that was looking forward to something greater. And then you have the second Adam, which fulfills where Adam has failed. And we are under that second Adam. So Paul kind of, we're not going to read the whole passage, but Romans 5, second half of it especially, Paul develops this theme. And something to keep in mind there is the fall did not catch God by surprise, right? It wasn't like Adam disobeyed, the fall happened, and God said, what do we do now? So I think the aspect there is the fact that all of this was part of the decrees of God looking forward to something greater to fulfill. The second one is the Noahic covenant. So in Genesis chapter 6, verses 8, you have this statement that is made. So the beginning of chapter 6, you have this great evil that is presented amongst the world. And then in verse 8, chapter 6, verse 8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. And that passage should almost, I think, is designed to shock us. Because you read the first 7 verses, and there is nothing but evil. Nothing but demise. Nothing but great evil. I mean, you got the Nephilim in there. However you understand that. So verse 8 is meant to kind of shock us in a sense. And then verse 9, these are the generations, verse 9, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among those in his generations. Noah walked with God. Again, I think that is designed to, in a sense, cause the reader to go, wait, but how does that happen? You just said there's great evil. So how does this work itself out? And then when you jump over to Genesis 8, verse 21, so this is after the flood, and Yahweh smelled the soothing aroma, and Yahweh said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never run again, and I will never again strike down every living thing as I have done. Part of that statement, I think, is also cause us to go, but how are you going to fix this problem of evil, God? Because the evil didn't disappear. You flooded you killed the whole creation. You rescued the 8 who were righteous in your sight. How were they righteous? Well, we're not necessarily told yet. So all of this, I think, is to drive the reader to look forward to something greater. And then you find this very interesting phrase in verse 16. So the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. Now there's a question there. How do we understand this everlasting covenant? Does this refer only to this physical creation covenant that was made there? Or is that usage meant to drive the reader to something further? If you look at all of those passages I listed on your sheet there of where this phrase is used, the everlasting covenant, it is all used in the context of God saving his people, God reconciling his creation to himself. So again, I think that phrase, the way it's picked up in the Abrahamic covenant, the way it's picked up in the Davidic covenant, the way it's picked up in the prophets, looking forward to the new covenant, I think it's made to drive us to go, what's coming? How is this all going to be solved? How is salvation going to be brought? How is this covenant, this everlasting covenant, going to be worked out? The Abrahamic covenant. Now, this one I think is easier because this one, I'm sure many of you, especially if you grew up in the church, the Abrahamic covenant, the very clear connections are made here between the Abrahamic covenant and the new covenant, and the fact that the Abrahamic covenant was always looking forward. So just two aspects, and again, we're looking at, just a few of the aspects of this. The blessing of the nations. So in Genesis 12, verse 3, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And then in 17:7, it says, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you throughout this generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you. You see that phrase again, everlasting covenant. And to your seed after you. And then in chapter 22, verse 18, in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have listened to my voice. Now, why did I read those passages specifically? Well, particularly because those passages are picked up by the New Testament authors. They're picked up by the apostles to speak to the fact that this is being fulfilled in the new covenant. I listed the passage there, Galatians chapter 3, and then one I don't have is Acts chapter 3. You can write it down, Acts chapter 3, I think it's 25, yeah. Verse 25, where Peter there's giving his sermon, and he picks up on this theme of Genesis 22, specifically of the earth being blessed, in your seed all the nations of the earth being blessed. So those phrases, again, are designed to get the reader to look forward, to not simply stop at Abram and his family and even the nation of Israel. They're designed to look forward to the whole creation, to this whole concept of God reconciling all things to himself. And then this concept of seed, we saw that in Galatians 3. We won't, for sake of time, go there right now, but again, Galatians 3 is a crucial passage in this whole discussion, because Paul picks up this same language, this same phraseology, this same theme of seed and the blessing of the nations, and he ties it directly to the new covenant. And he says that it is here and now being fulfilled. And the Gentile is brought in and is placed under Abraham in the same way that the Jew is brought in, because it rests in faith, which ties this covenant together, ties these covenants together. So in the Abrahamic covenant, we see this terminology that is meant to get us to look forward. The Mosaic covenant. Now, the Mosaic covenant, and this is the covenant that when the prophets refer kind of to the old covenant, the covenant that I established with your fathers, it's really referring to the Sinaitic covenant, to this the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant. But this covenant was also never meant to be just strictly physical in nature. It was never meant just to be moralistic in nature. It always in it had a looking forward to an ultimate goal of an inward change. So you see it right towards the end, Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 16. I think it goes... Oh, I'm sorry, that's chapter 10. Deuteronomy 10 I'm starting with. Deuteronomy 10, starting with 12. So now, Israel, what does Yahweh your God ask from you, but to fear Yahweh your God, to walk in all of his ways, and to love him, and to serve Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of Yahweh and his statutes, which I am commanding you today for your good. Behold, to Yahweh your God belong heaven and the highest heavens, the earth and all that is in it. Yet on your fathers did Yahweh set affection to love them, and he chose their seed after them, even you above all peoples, as it is this day. So circumcise your heart and stiffen your neck no longer. So again, you see in the Mosaic covenant this whole concept of there's a drive for inward change. There's a drive for inward obedience. The law was never meant to be simply outwardly obeyed, and that's it. It was meant always to drive the people of God to an inward change which would create that full and complete obedience. How's that going to be accomplished? Partly that's what the reader is to ask at this time. In chapter 30, Deuteronomy chapter 30, you have very similar language. So 6. So, I mean, we can start from beginning, but this is in that context of the curses and the blessings, which we'll actually return to this passage, but I'll just read 6. Moreover, Yahweh your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed to love Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul, so that you may live. And Yahweh your God will inflict all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you, who persecuted you. And you shall return and listen to the voice of Yahweh, and you shall do all his commandments, which I am commanding you today. Now, it's interesting, again, this is being spoken to already the second generation of the people that left from Egypt. So you had one generation that has already disobeyed, has already died off, and Moses here is pleading with this second generation, but his pleading and his statement to them is that God will circumcise your heart. God will cause you to love him. When's this going to happen? How is this going to look? So we see even in the Mosaic covenant this looking forward to something greater. This looking forward to not just outward obedience, but an inward change which is going to complete the outward obedience, the outward change. And then Hebrews 8, we're going to return to Hebrews at the end, but Hebrews 8, Hebrews 9, and Hebrews 10, that whole section is very important, this whole discussion of the new covenant. But there you see these phrases of copy and shadow of the good things to come. So when you think about the law, you think about the old covenant, you think about everything that was going on there, that was all. The writer of Hebrews is looking back at that, and he is saying we are to view that, and that was designed to be viewed as a copy of the heavenly things, and which means it's not the final thing, which means that there's something better and greater coming, and that there is something better and greater, but also it's the shadow of the good things to come. I believe that's from Hebrews 10, if I remember correctly, that phraseology is used. So Mosaic covenant, you have the same theme. Then the last one, Davidic covenant. This one, we can spend the whole hour just talking about this one, but 2 Samuel chapter 7, this is where Yahweh establishes his covenant with David, but in verse 12 it says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up one of your seed after you who will come forth from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. Verse 13, he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Verse 16, and your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever, and your throne shall be established forever. So you have this terminology again that's used of seed, You have this terminology of the eternal kingdom that's being used, this eternality, this perseverance that is going to take place. I think it's all designed for the reader to go, how is this going to look? How is this going to be understood? And the Jewish people, I mean, you see this even during Jesus' time, the Jewish people are wrestling with this whole terminology. How do we understand all of it? What does this mean? So it's designed to get us to look forward. How is this going to be fulfilled? And then you have this interesting phrase, Adonai Yahweh, in verse 18. Then David the king went in and sat before Yahweh, and he said, who am I, O Lord Yahweh, which is Adonai Yahweh? And what is my house that you have brought me this far? This specific title, I think, is a covenantal title that connects. If you look at, I list all the different passages there in where it's used, because it's used all the way back in Genesis, and then it's used in Deuteronomy, and then it's used, I think, over 200 times in the prophets. Just Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, just in those three prophets alone, in the context of God speaking to his people, his covenantal people. So I think David here is, just by using that, I think he is establishing and tying this covenant that's being made with him to all the previous covenants that have been established, and then what is to come in the future. And then at the end of verse 19, you have this interesting phrase. So I'll read from the beginning. And yet this was a small thing in your eyes, O Lord Yahweh, for you have spoken also of the house of your slave concerning the distant future, and this is the law of man, O Lord Yahweh. So at the end of this whole phrase, this is the law of man. It's a really debated phrase. What is going on there? What is it referring to? Even if you look at different translations of the Bible, like the NIV will translate it differently. Different translations of the Bible will translate it differently. Does it mean literally law? What exactly is it referring to? How do we understand it? But I think the best way to understand it, again, in a covenantal context, which is where this is given, is the fact that he's simply saying that this covenant that is being established is part of this law of man, meaning this is the governing body, the revelation of God, how God is going to govern with his people. And that phrase, again, also looks back to what God has done, and it's looking forward to how are these covenants going to be fulfilled. Okay. We probably spent way too much time on that because that's all just introduction. But all of those covenants, I hope that helps, because all of those covenants are designed to get us to look forward. They're designed to get us to go, but what's coming next? How is this going to be fulfilled? How's this going to work out? Okay, so coming now to the new covenant. How do we understand the new covenant? I think the new covenant is best understood in the larger categories and maybe themes, you can call it, of covenantal judgment and covenantal restoration or fulfillment. Now, usually when you think about the new covenant, a lot of times when it's presented, the second one is where there's a lot of focus on. The first one, in many ways, is a lot of times either neglected or not really properly understood, and it's also the more controversial one. So we're going to dive right into the controversy and try to understand it. But before we get to that, so you have the larger themes of judgment and restoration. A good way to see it is by comparing two psalms. So if you go to Psalm 89, Psalm 89, it's not a short psalm, but it's a psalm that splits. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's split into three main parts. The first part, verses 1 through 18, is just almost kind of a praise song, just praising God for who he is, what he has done. 19 through 37 is almost kind of a summary of 2 Samuel 7, which is a summary of the Davidic covenant, the covenant that God made with David. And then verses 38 to the end is really what the psalm is driving to, and it is a lament of how this covenant seems like it has failed. So we see in verse 38, but you have cast off and rejected. You have been full of wrath against your anointed. I'll skip down for sake of time. But at the end, verse 39, where are your former loving kindnesses, O Lord, which you swore to David in your faithfulness? Remember, O Lord, the reproach of your slaves. So the psalmist there summarizes the covenant with David, and then he laments how it seems like this covenant has completely failed because the people are in exile. The people are nowhere near being fulfilled in terms of what God has promised. But then you jump over to Psalm 132, and 132 looks at the other aspect of this. And this is where the covenantal promises are restored. And we can compare just a couple of the verses to kind of get the thrust of this. 89 verse 39, you have spurned the covenant of your slave, you have profaned his crown to the ground. And then 132 verse 18, his enemies I will clothe with shame, but upon him his crown shall blossom. So on the one hand, you have the crown of the king just being destroyed. The king is nowhere to be found. The kingdom is destroyed. On the other, the enemies are the ones who are destroyed, and the crown is blossoming. The kingdom is blossoming. 89:42, you have exalted the right hand of his adversaries and have made all his enemies be glad. By the way, that's talking about David, specifically talking about how this promise that you made, God, it's not working. And then the response, 132 verse 18, his enemies I will clothe with shame, but upon him his crown shall blossom. Again, look, reversing. On the one hand, you have the enemies prospering, the king is down. On the other hand, you have the enemies that are down and destroyed, and the king is prospering. So all of this is looking at these two themes that are going to be picked up by the new covenant of judgment. God will judge his covenant breakers, and God is going to restore and fulfill his covenant promises in the new covenant. Okay, so let's start with the theme of the judgment of God's old covenant people. Again, we're going to jump through a lot of these passages. Just if you don't want to flip through them, that's fine. You have them on your sheet, but you can just follow along. So Leviticus 26. So what am I trying to do here? I'm trying to get us to see that a crucial aspect of what is being fulfilled in the new covenant is judgment upon the covenant breakers. God promised that he will judge his people when they break his covenant. So Leviticus 26, verse 17. And I will... we can start with 14. But if you do not obey me and do not do all these commandments, if instead you reject my statutes, and if your soul loathes my judgments so as not to do all my commandments and so break my covenant, I in turn will do this to you. I will appoint over you a sudden terror, consumption and fever that will waste away the eyes and cause the soul to pine away. Also you will sow your seed uselessly, for your enemies will eat it up. And I will set my face against you so that you will be defeated before your enemies. And those who hate you will have dominion over you, and you will flee when no one is pursuing you. If also after these things you do not obey me, then I will discipline you 7 times more for your sins. I will also break down your pride of strength. I will also give your sky over to become like iron, and your earth like bronze, and your power will be spent uselessly, for your land will not give forth its produce, and the trees of the land will not give forth their fruit. What do we see there? We see judgment. God promises to judge the covenant breakers. And the language that's being used there is language that I'm going to argue is being picked up by the New Testament in the judgment passages. Deuteronomy 28, we return. We're going to read all 3 chapters. No, I'm just kidding. Deuteronomy 28 through 30, that's that famous of the blessings and the cursings. So God will bless the obedient ones, and God will curse the covenant breakers. And the way, and even from when we read the passage that we did read from 30, even the way the passage is written, it is written as if with this assumption of this will happen. You will break my covenant. You will disobey. Which is very interesting. God, again, in his sovereignty, he knows that. I think God knew about the new covenant when he was giving the Mosaic covenant. Hopefully you believe that. But the language, again, that's being used there is one of judgment. And if you read through that, it's very clear. It is referring to God will judge his covenant breakers. And then Isaiah. And we'll spend a lot of time in Isaiah because it's such a great book in bringing out a lot of these themes. Isaiah 24. This is talking about, again, judgment on the earth, judgment and destruction upon the nations, and the language that's being used is picked up throughout Isaiah on judgment of his people, his covenant breakers. In the beginning, behold, Yahweh empties the earth to destruction, eviscerates it, distorts its surface, and scatters its inhabitants. And the people will be like the priest, the male slave like his master, the female slave like her mistress, the buyer like the seller, the lender like the borrower, the creditor like the debtor. The earth will be completely emptied to destruction and completely plundered, for Yahweh has spoken this word. The earth mourns and withers, the word languishes and withers. The exalted of the people of the earth languish. The earth is also polluted by its inhabitants, for they trespassed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant. See that phrase again that's being picked up. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and those who inhabit it are held guilty. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men remain. You have a description there again of God pouring out his judgment. And I want to specifically just take a notice of the language that's being used and how this language is describing the specific judgments that are taking place. And the point is that this language is not necessarily designed to be taken literal as if there's going to be some kind of earth devouring that's taking place. It's designed to get the reader to realize of the seriousness of God's judgment. And it's also going to be the language that's going to be picked up by the New Testament authors. Same chapter, going to verse 19. The earth is broken asunder, the earth is split through, the earth is shaken violently, the earth reels to and fro like a drunkard, and it totters like a shack, for its transgression is heavy upon it, and it will fall never to rise again. So it will be in that day that Yahweh will punish the host of heights on high, and the kings of the earth on earth. They will be gathered together like prisoners in the pit, and will be confined in prison, and after many days they will be punished. Then the moon will be humiliated and the sun ashamed, for Yahweh of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders. Again, notice the language that's being used of the sun, of the moon, of the destruction, the kings being destroyed. This is language, I think, that's designed to get us to think about God's judgment, and then it's also designed to get us to realize that when the New Testament authors talk about the judgment that is coming upon covenant breakers, it's taking us back to these passages. We'll jump over to Joel and then come back to Isaiah. Now, Joel 2 is important because it's the specific passage that Peter quotes in his sermon in the book of Acts. So Joel 2, I probably won't read the whole passage, but just start in the beginning. Blow a trumpet in Zion and make a loud shout on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of Yahweh is coming. Surely it is near, a day of darkness and thick darkness, a day of clouds and dense gloom, as the dawn is spread over the mountains. So there is a numerous and mighty people. There has never been anything like it, nor will there be again after it, for the years from generation to generation. And then on, and it continues to describe this great judgment that's coming into the world, and specifically the judgment upon God's covenant breakers. And then at the end of that chapter, this is the passage that Peter quotes, and it will be afterwards, verse 28, that I will pour out my spirit on all mankind, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions, even on the male slaves and female slaves. I will in those days pour out my spirit, and I will put wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke, and the sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of Yahweh comes. And it will be that everyone who calls in the name of Yahweh will be delivered. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be those who escape, as Yahweh has said, even among the survivors whom Yahweh calls. Now, when Peter quotes this passage, he is quoting and saying that this is being fulfilled in this day. And that's what I want us to see. As we work through these passages and then we jump into the New Testament, hopefully this language will be that same language that you will see being used in the New Testament. Going back to Isaiah 65, this is a great chapter in tying a lot of these things together, and we're only going to read just the first portion of it, and then we'll come back to it. Isaiah 65, I permitted myself to be sought by those who did not ask for me. I permitted myself to be found by those who did not seek me. Again, this is in the context of God talking to his people and saying that there's judgment that will come upon you. I said, here am I, to a nation which did not call my name. I have spread out my hands all day long to a rebellious people, Romans 10, that's where it's quoted, who walk in the way which is not good, following their own thoughts, a people who continually provoke me to my face, offering sacrifices in gardens and burning incense on bricks, who sit among graves and spend the night in secret places, who eat swine's flesh, and the broth of offensive meat is in their pots, who say, keep to yourselves, do not come near me, for I am holier than you. These are smoke in my nostrils, a fire that burns all the day. Behold, it is written before me, I will not keep silent, but I will repay. I will even repay into their bosom both their own iniquities and their iniquities of their fathers together, says Yahweh. Because they have burnt incense on the mountains and reproached me on the hills, therefore I will measure their former work into their bosom. What's the context there? The context, again, is judgment of the covenant breakers. Those who break the covenant, God will judge them. All of these passages that we read, the context of God judging the covenant breakers, God judging the people that break his covenant. Now, what I want us to see now is jumping in, and we're not going to read all of that, but what I want us to see is how the final fulfillment of this judgment is seen in Jesus' day on that generation. And this is tied directly to the new covenant. This is where we have to start when we talk about the new covenant. We have to start with the fact that the new covenant begins with God judging his covenant breakers. So, jumping to the New Testament, Luke 15, we're not going to read these. I'm sure you're familiar with these parables. But Luke 15, you have the famous parable of the prodigal son. What is the beginning of Luke 15? Now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near him to listen to him. And both the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So, as a result of that, Jesus mildly and lovely rebuked them with parables. So he told them this parable, saying, what's the purpose of the parable? I'm sure many of you know the purpose of this parable is to demonstrate that these religious leaders, they are the ones who are breaking the covenant. They represent the older son. Everything seems perfect. They're morally obedient. Everything is great. And Jesus looks directly at them and says, you are like that son. You're like that older son who thinks you have everything figured out and everything is great. But actually, you are completely ignoring and breaking the covenant. Luke 16, the first 18 verses, Jesus continues with another parable, and he's continuing the rebuke. And this is the parable of the unrighteous steward. And then after the parable, excuse me, the conversation is one of money, and he says in verse 14, now the Pharisees who were lovers of money were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him. And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts, for that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. We can keep reading, but we'll stop there. What is the point of these parables? The point of these parables, I think very clearly, Jesus is trying to get the reader to understand, get the Pharisees to understand that these judgments, you are the ones who are labeled, you are the covenant breakers, Pharisees. You are the covenant breakers, Sadducees. Now, we'll see this much more clearer when we go into, well, I guess there's one more here, and that is the rich man and Lazarus. And in there, at the end, you have the famous account of, you have the rich man saying, well, send somebody from the dead. And then Abraham says, well, they have Moses and the prophets. Why is he saying that? Well, again, he's tying this back to everything that has previously been developed in the covenants. And what's the response? He says, well, no, if somebody goes from, they won't accept that. But if somebody comes from the dead, they'll listen to him. And Abraham said, no, they won't. They won't listen to him. Again, what is the drive there? I think the drive, the point of these parables is to rebuke the Pharisees, rebuke the religious leaders, to understand that they are in the line of the covenant breakers. And when we jump to Matthew, I think we'll see that even clearer, because Matthew, I think, just flat out says that. Matthew 21, we're kind of working our way over to Matthew 24, that awesome chapter. Matthew 21, verse 28, you have the parable of the two sons. Son, go work today in the vineyard. He says, I won't, but then afterwards he repents and goes. The second one says, I will, and doesn't go. Jesus said to them, truly I say to you that the tax collectors and prostitutes will get into the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and prostitutes did believe him, and you, seeing this, did not even regret afterward so as to believe him. Okay, the same theme, the same terminology is being picked up in this parable, again, of rebuking the religious leaders and pretty much saying that they are rebuking they are disobeying in the same way that the previous generation. And we'll see that as we go through. And so staying in the same chapter, chapter 21, verse 33 to 46, you have the parable of the vine growers. And this is the one that I think is most helpful in this, because it is here that you have the prophets that are being sent, the prophets are being killed, and then you have the son that is sent. And then they look at the son, and then they kill the son. And Jesus looks at them and says, well, what should be done with them? What did they say? He will bring those wretches to a wretched end and will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at the proper seasons. And I could just see the Pharisees going, yeah, we got this right. Yeah, that's right, Jesus. You asked us and we got it right. And then Jesus looks at them and says, did you never read the scriptures? Because you just walked right into my trap. The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from Yahweh, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a nation producing the fruit of it. And he who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but on whoever it falls, it will scatter him like dust. And when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, look, see how it's plural? It's tying these parables together. They heard his parables. They understood that he was speaking about them. And although we don't have to finish that out, but what's the point there? Jesus directly looks at them and says, you are killing the son. You will kill the son in the same exact way that you have killed the prophets. Now, did those people there, the Pharisees, physically kill the prophets? Well, no, they didn't. But what is he doing? He is saying you are in the line of the covenant breakers that have killed the prophets, and you are about to kill the son. Continue on with the parables. So Matthew 23. Oh, and this is actually not the parables. That's it with the parables I wanted to look at. But Matthew 23, what is the context of this chapter? The scribes and the Pharisees are being completely denounced and rebuked by Jesus. You have all the woes that are being poured out upon them. And then at the end, look at what Jesus says. So starting with 31. And I mean, you can really read that whole section. But so you bear witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How will you escape the sentence of hell? On account of this, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. And that's the key. That's where I'm trying to drive all this. The judgments that were described and prophesied and promised on the covenant breakers is being fulfilled in Jesus' day upon the covenant breakers. And the key is right there, verse 36, all these things will come upon this generation. And then the great controversial chapter of verse 24, I'm not going to take the time to read it, but if you read 24, start with 23, because it comes before, and it makes sense. If you read 24, The language that is used there is the same language that we have read about the judgment that is being poured out on the covenant breakers. And Jesus beautifully ties that in his rebuke of the Pharisees and the religious leaders. And he says that all of these things, these judgments, he, by the way, he first of all ties them to to those who persecuted the prophets of the past. And then he brings in the judgments that will come upon those that was prophesied upon those. And then he said, this is being fulfilled in this generation. This is being fulfilled now. And I believe Matthew 24 and what's being described in Revelation about the judgment that is to come is that judgment that is being fulfilled, that was promised upon the covenant breakers. And that is where the new covenant begins. The new covenant begins with God judging the covenant breakers. And we spent way too much time on that because we didn't get to the restoration. But we're going to get to it just for a little bit. So that's the judgment. That's the first part. The second part is the restoration. And that is the new covenant is also the category is of the restoration of God's people through the new covenant. And you have the passages there in front of you, but I want to just go back to Isaiah 65 because I frankly just really like that chapter. And I think it's very helpful in tying a lot of these themes together. But remember, we read the first 7 verses. And if you keep reading, I think it helps us in tying a lot of these themes together. So, thus says Yahweh, starting in verse 8, as the new wine is found in the cluster, and when one says, do not make it a ruin, for there is benefit in it, so I will act on behalf of my slaves, in order not to make all of them a ruin. I will bring forth a seed from Jacob, and a possessor of my mountains from Judah. Even my chosen ones shall possess it, and my slaves will dwell there. Sharon will be a pasture land for flocks, and the valley of Achor a resting place for herds, for my people who seek me. But you who forsake Yahweh, who forget my holy mountain, who set a table for fortune, and who fill cups with mixed wine for destiny, I will destine you for the sword, and all of you will bow down to the slaughter, because I called, but you did not answer. I spoke, but you did not hear, and you did what was evil in my eyes, and chose that in which I was not pleased. Again, 65 is wonderful because it kind of mixes and intertwines this whole concept of God's judgment and God's restoration. Therefore, thus says Lord Yahweh, behold, my slaves will eat, but you will be hungry. Behold, my slaves will drink, but you will be thirsty. Behold, my slaves will be glad, but you will be put to shame. So notice again, you will be hungry, the covenant breakers, because I'm going to judge you. But my slaves will eat. The other ones will eat. Behold, my slaves will shout joyfully with a merry heart, but you will cry out with a pained heart, and you will wail with a broken spirit. You will leave your name for a curse to my chosen ones. And Lord Yahweh will put you to death, but my slaves will be called by another name, because he who is blessed in the earth will be blessed by the God of truth, and he who swears in the earth will swear by the God of truth, because the former distresses are forgotten, and because they are hidden from my sight. And then in verse 17, Isaiah describes the new heavens and the earth. But it is all in the context of the new covenant being fulfilled. For behold, I am creating a new heavens and a new earth, and the former things will not be remembered or come upon the heart, but be joyful and rejoice forever in what I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem for rejoicing and her people for joy. And we can keep reading and keep reading. But I think this chapter is very helpful because it is this chapter which ties the theme of judgment and restoration and the fulfillment in the new covenant together. Therefore, when the New Testament picks up on this theme of the new heaven and the new earth, it's not talking about the eternal state. Because if you read Isaiah 66, there's death that's taking place. And there's no death in the eternal state. Because if there's death in the eternal state, what's going to be really different, right? So the promise of restoration and this promise and this language of God creating something new is picked up by the New Testament writers, by the gospel writers especially, to talk about the new covenant coming into fruition. And one more passage, Isaiah 51. I think this one is helpful too. Isaiah 51 verse 15. For I am Yahweh your God, who stirs up the sea and its waves roar. Yahweh of hosts is his name. I have put my words in your mouth and have covered you with the shadow of my hand, to establish the heavens, to found the earth, and to say to Zion, you are my people. Notice there the language that's being used there. God is saying that when I am establishing my covenant with my people, it is as if I am creating a new heaven and a new earth. God is tying the language of creation with the language of establishing a covenant with his people. And he's calling them, you are my people. And I think this is exactly what the New Testament authors pick up on when they are talking about the new covenant. When the new covenant comes into fruition, it is first manifested in the judgment of the covenant breakers, and then it was manifested in the restoration of the new creation. And that's language that Paul uses about the new creation. Now, there's so much more, and unfortunately we are out of time, and I didn't plan out the time very well there, but Jeremiah 31 is probably the most crucial passage to talk about why is the new covenant unique and how does it fulfill. And let me just read the points just to kind of summarize it, and then if there's any questions we can get into a little bit more. But Jeremiah 31, let me read it. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but you really have to read all three chapters, 30 to 33 in Jeremiah. For that whole section is referring to this aspect of restoration and the covenant that God is going to establish. But specifically this passage, behold, days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will sow the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of man and with the seed of beast. And it will be that as I have watched over them to uproot, to tear down, to pull down, to destroy, and to bring calamity, so I will watch over them to build and to plant, declares Yahweh. In those days they will not say again, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge, but everyone will die for his own iniquity. Each man who eats the sour grapes, his teeth will be set on edge. Behold, days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will cut a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And this is where that phrase new covenant comes from. It's the only, to my knowledge, it's the only time in Scripture where it's used. And that's kind of where we get it from. And with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I cut with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, and these are this context of the covenant breakers which will be judged. But I was a husband to them, declares Yahweh. But this is the covenant which I will cut with the house of Israel after those days, declares Yahweh. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they will not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, know Yahweh, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares Yahweh. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. So that is a foundational passage when you want to talk about how is the restoration of God's people in the new covenant being fulfilled and different or unique from the other covenants. And unfortunately, we don't have time to kind of work a lot of that out. But what I was going to do is go into Hebrews, because Hebrews develops this wonderfully. And let me just read kind of my points, and then we'll stop there. But Hebrews chapter 7, the author is, the writer of Hebrews is arguing about the superiority of Christ and the superiority of this new covenant. And he says that Christ is the one and permanent high priest. The work of Christ is everlasting and perfect. The old covenant administration was instituted to be a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. The new covenant has been enacted or made law with better promises. And those are from Hebrews chapter 8. You can read those later then. The old covenant was not faultless, for it contained only in part what the new covenant contains in full. Hebrews 8 verse 7 argues that. And then the rest of the Hebrews 8 of that passage talks about how is it superior. Number one, it is not like the old covenant, which was comprised of believers and unbelievers. And this is where the uniqueness of Reformed Baptists come in versus our Presbyterian friends, and I would argue this is where we are correct and they are not. Because Hebrews chapter 8 makes it very clear that the main emphasis of the new covenant is the fact that it does not contain in it unbelievers. Therefore, we do not baptize our children. The new covenant is comprised of regenerated believers only. Hebrews 8, verse 10. Thirdly, all members of the new covenant will internally know Yahweh. Hebrews 8, verse 11. And then the last thing is, all members of the new covenant receive the forgiveness of their sins offered by the grace of God to his elect. That's Hebrews 8, verse 12. So I apologize for going through that kind of quick. I probably spent a little too much time on the first part of the lesson, but Jeremiah 31, and then I would go into Hebrews chapter 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 and read through those, because we have a inspired interpretation of Jeremiah 31. And anytime you have an inspired interpretation of an Old Testament passage, you have to start there. And that's the uniqueness of covenant theology. Because covenant theology sees that the new covenant scriptures, they have priority in describing the old covenant scriptures. And that's important to understand. And then the end result of the new covenant, those are some passages there that you can read through. What does that mean for us today? Well, simply put, it means victory. It means, I'll end on this, Matthew 24. If you go to Matthew 24, verses 13 and 14. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be proclaimed in the whole world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. That's what it means for us. That's the end result of the new covenant. The end result of the new covenant is that all of the promises are fulfilled, are being fulfilled, and will be fulfilled. God is going to be victorious through his people, through the church. That's the end result of the new covenant. And we'll end it there. Thank you again for coming out.